everyone. I'm Petra McGowan, the Director of Coral Reef Partnerships from the Reef Resilience Network at the Nature Conservancy, and I'd like to welcome you to the sixth event in our Ocean Sewage series on how working with the sanitation sector can improve reef health. Today, we're going to have a panel to learn about the wash sector, and I'm excited that we have three great panelists with us. Alexandria Campbell-Ferrari, Ian, sorry Ian, I just had your name and now I'm gonna mess it up. Let me try, Moise, and Virginia Newton-Lewis. So each of them are bringing some different experience that we're gonna share, and it's going to be a 1-hour webinar. The recording is gonna be sent out afterwards, so don't worry about that, and it'll be posted on our website. And there's a question and answer session at the end as well. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, use the question box and we'll try to help you if you're having trouble seeing the slides. So just chat in your question there. So before we introduce the panelists and start our discussion, I would like to introduce what is the water, sanitation, hygiene, and wash sector. So here is a definition for those of you guys that maybe have not heard of the wash sector. I know I hadn't heard of that working in coral reef issues, and so it's a new concept for me. And what it is it's a sector dedicated to realizing the human right to safe, reliable drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene services. Equitable access to these services, protecting public health and the environment, and this includes advocating for laws to ensure equity, safety, and long-term durable solutions. So what does this mean? Well, for a lot of organizations in WASH, we're learning that they're centering their work around the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations. And as some of you may know, there's 17 of those goals, and goal 6 specifically focuses on clean water and sanitation. So WASH initiatives can improve people's access to clean water for drinking. Can you do the next slide? So examples of some of these projects to get an idea. They can improve people's access to clean water for drinking, disposal of human waste. They can raise awareness of good hygiene practices. And as you can see from this list here, there's a lot of different types of projects that could be considered a WASH project. Next slide, please. Now, who's doing WASH? Well, there's all levels of organizations doing WASH, I'm learning. So global agencies like the World Health Organization, United Nations Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF, right? Also government agencies at different levels, all the way from federal or national level to the local governments and municipalities would be considered WASH sector. And then nonprofits as well, like the Sustainable Sanitation Alliance and many others. So our three panelists today all work within organizations that belong on this list. And I'm gonna have each of the panelists share a quick overview kind of their organization, the work that they do to help us with our discussion. And I just have to say the reason we've decided this is a really important discussion for the network is since we started working on the sewage content a year ago, we keep hearing about the WASH sector and how it's this whole group of people and organizations that are doing work around this topic that managers have prioritized and that we should work with them. But we're like, who are these people? How do you work with them? And that's what we're here today to try to figure out. So I'm gonna start off with Virginia Newton-Lewis. Virginia, can you join me and turn your camera on? She's the Interim Director of Policy and Advocacy at WaterAid. She specializes in water security as it relates to WASH, and she's worked on a wide range of water issues, including food security, irrigation, water resource management, flood risk, a lot. So I'm excited to learn a bit more. So thanks, Virginia. turning it over to you.
Thank you very much, Petra. Good evening, everybody, or good lunchtime, I think, where most of you are. Thank you for having me. As Petra said, I'm from WaterAid, and WaterAid, if you don't know and you don't know the water sector very well, is an international not-for-profit determined to make clean water, decent toilets, and good hygiene normal for everyone, everywhere within a generation. Our work on water, sanitation, and hygiene, so that's this WASH concept, contributes to Sustainable Development Goal 6, as you saw in the previous slide, which is about water, but it also works towards achieving the human right to water and sanitation. Next slide, please, Petra. Thank you. So if you haven't been working in the WASH sector, you might not know, but the scale of the WASH problem is huge. And while progress is certainly being made, we have an awful long way to go to meet these Sustainable Development Goal targets by 2030, and we really need to accelerate action. I wanted to spend a minute talking with you about these quite staggering numbers. I mean, they really are enormous. So let's have a look. During the global pandemic, so that's in 2020, 2.3 billion people lacked access to basic hygiene services. So that means that they didn't have soap and water to wash their hands in their house, and that's during a pandemic. A quarter of the world, so that's about 2 billion people, also do not have access to safely managed drinking water. And you'll keep hearing these terms, safely managed. It's kind of this technical jargon in the wash world. But what it means is that they can't access safe water that is on their premises and available when they need it. Around half the world lacks access to something called safely managed sanitation. So that means they don't have access to something like a toilet or a latrine that isn't shared with another household, and where the waste is safely dealt with. So the entire kind of focus of the sector around sanitation is separating waste from people because of the obvious public and environmental health considerations. So we see that half the world have systems where that's either not done or done poorly. And finally, we've just seen the latest figures come out on wastewater treatment, and it isn't looking good. So of the only 42 countries who reported their statistics to the UN, we can see that only a third of wastewater is treated before it's discharged. And I would hazard a guess that the real figure is much worse than that, because it's not only about the 42 countries that we've seen reporting their statistics, nor is it about whether or not there are actually just wastewater treatment plants, but it's about whether those wastewater treatment plants actually work. Are they functional? And also the fact that many people's sanitation systems aren't connected to wastewater treatment systems at all. So next slide, please. So how do you tackle problems like this? How does WaterAid work on this topic? Well, we describe our work with a phrase, and I apologise here for it not being a very catchy phrase, but the phrase is, do some, build capacity, and influence the rest. Or in other words, a little bit of service delivery, so that's the taps and toilets and well building. You might have seen some of our communications work. And then an awful lot more capacity building and advocacy work at all levels, including at the global level, which is where most of my work is. This emphasis on influencing and advocacy actually represents quite a shift in the way that WaterAid has worked over the years. We were born in 1981 and we came out of the UK water industry, so we started with a much more engineering and service delivery focus. And in practice, this kind of do some, build capacity and influence the rest involves an awful lot more other tasks. So the first one that I wanted to draw to your attention is around analysing context. Each country we work in has a unique culture, a unique wash sector and wash needs, and a technology or approach that works in one country may not work in another. So that's another thing for you to take away, that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. We also work in partnership. This is key. So we work with different actors, including government institutions, communities, local NGOs, and we also partner, and this may be of interest to your group, we partner with actors in other sectors such as health, climate and education, or anyone else that's not that's relevant to the WASH objectives. And lastly, we really focus on critical analysis, so to understand what's working and what's not, and to build those lessons into our programme and advocacy work. And last slide, please. And just to give you a sense of the global nature of our work, this map shows where we have our country programs. So those are our projects and country offices, our member offices. So these are places where we kind of raise money, and some of our regional teams. So all in all, we're present across 34 countries. And that's it now from WaterAid. Thank you, Petra.
Thanks so much. Excited to learn more in a minute. So I now am going to introduce Ian Moise. He's a globally recognized expert in WASH and environment. He's worked in over 40 countries as a technical advisor, program manager, extension agent, and leader. It's included the United States Peace Corps, the Agency for International Development, and European Union, NGOs, consulting firms, and the World Bank, and many foreign governments. So Ian, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Petra. Thanks for having me and letting me speak with your group. And nice work on my last name. You hit it right on the mark, so appreciate that. I'm also very happy to be following Virginia because I formerly in my career, I've worked in a lot of places, including several large NGOs, Save the Children Catholic Relief Services. I've worked with WaterAid quite a bit. And they bring a lot to the table, especially on the advocacy and communication side. So while Virginia had the pretty slides with lots of good information, I have kind of more stale, boring slide, just one here to tell you a little bit about DT Global. So I'm happy we started off with the pretty slides. So DT Global is a primarily U.S. government contractor, whereas, as I mentioned, WaterAid focuses a little bit more on capacity building, influence, and advocacy. We do focus a little bit more on the service delivery side. Similar to WaterAid, we've evolved as a company over the years, formerly doing a lot of the engineering ourselves, and now supporting countries and partners in countries where we work to undertake projects in water sanitation and hygiene. Our name is relatively new, actually, for those who haven't heard of DT Global. We were formerly AECOM International Development until several years ago. And prior to that, we have other legacy companies. So we do bring 50 years of experience, relationships, and technical expertise to the water sanitation and hygiene sector. We're operational in 90 countries or so. And we have corporate offices in Spain, the US, and Australia. I think the interesting thing about the work we do, I mean, having worked on the NGO side and also on the USAID contractor side, we're all in the same game, trying to affect the numbers that Virginia highlighted in terms of lack of access to water, sanitation, and hygiene. On our side, we use a different mechanism, the contracting mechanism, so we deliver on services that the US government determines, whereas on the NGO side, the US government works more closely with the NGOs to design projects. For us, we're designing projects that USAID tells us to design. So it's a slight difference. The difference between DT Global, perhaps a unique aspect of us, is that we are a network of companies that it's called the DT Global family. We have a for-profit company, a nonprofit organization, a charitable trust, and we all come together to achieve our goals. I'll speak more to some of the kind of technical aspects of the work that we do later, but happy to answer questions and as we go forward. And certainly you can contact me if you have questions specifically about DT Global. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ian, for that great overview. And now I'm going to introduce our third panelist, Alexandria Campbell-Ferrari. She's the co-founder and executive director of the Center for Water Security and Cooperation. She specializes in water security and WASH law, works with stakeholders spanning from civil society groups, nonprofits, governments, all to understand, evaluate, and innovate in water law to help achieve universal access to water and sanitation. She also teaches water at Maryland Carey School of Law and the American University Washington College of Law. Thanks, Alexandria, for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much for having me. It's awesome to be here to have the chance to chat with you about this issue. Really, really critical issue. It's oftentimes I talk a lot about how the area of water is siloed between WASH and water resources management and oceans, and it's all siloed out, and no one really talks to each other, and there's not a lot of interaction. Recently, that's been starting to change. So this is ahead of the curve, and so I'm excited to be here and have this chance to talk to you. Where I focus is on the law, and you might be asking yourself, how does law get us access to water and sanitation? How does law protect our waters? And it's hard to imagine when you think of all the great technology out there, the fact there's a lot of focus on infrastructure, but at the foundation of all of it is the law. The law sets forth the basic rules, what we have to do, what we can't do. And it sets that foundation so that we know what we need to do in order to reach the goals that we set out. So if our goal is to protect our surface waters, to protect our oceans, to protect the coral reefs, then we can work back from that and say, okay, well, what rules do we need to put in place in order to protect those waters, protect those oceans, and protect those coral reefs? And so that's what we look at. We look at the law, and we look at whether or not it's sufficient to actually achieve all those really lofty goals that we set out. And what's great is that there's an interaction between them. So all the goals that we set out that are specific to each of these little areas, like protecting our surface area or our surface waters, or protecting our oceans, or protecting our flora and fauna, or ensuring that there's clean, safe drinking water, all of them are really interconnected. And so I have on the slide just a visual of how this all works, right? So we have written law that we write down. We have to implement it though, right? I talk a lot about how we focus on not only law, but the practice of law, because the law as written is the starting point. But if the law isn't practiced, if it isn't implemented, if it isn't applied, if it isn't enforced, then it really becomes less of an impactful tool, and your foundation starts to crumble a little bit. And all of this leads you to the results that you want. So I have a little bit of an example below to make more sense of this. So if you set out in a law that contamination is prohibited, so you cannot contaminate the environment, and different laws say this differently, so sometimes it's as broad as that broadly contamination is prohibited. Some countries talk about discharges, so the discharge of contaminants or the discharge of pollution is prohibited. That's often the starting point. Sometimes it isn't. Actually, some water laws don't even talk about the fact that contamination is prohibited. But let's assume that's the starting point. That's what you'd want to find in your law. The way that it's implemented and enforced is through the fact that we set effluent limitations. We say, okay, if you're a wastewater treatment plant, then you can only discharge this quantity, this volume of nitrates, this volume of other contaminants, right? So it sets out those limitations. When it comes to non-sewer sanitation, let's say septic tanks or pit latrines, then most of the time the regulation should, though this is a much more developing area of law, but it should set out design specs. It should say, okay, well, this is how you create or build a non-sewer sanitation facility that is going to protect the groundwater, is going to effectively capture and contain our human waste and ensure that it doesn't not just contaminate the groundwater, but contaminate the surface water. And so with that, when you have those things in place, then you're able to ensure that human waste doesn't reach our surface waters, which doesn't reach our oceans, which doesn't lead to and exacerbate algae blooms and other results from too much nitrate being in the surface water. And so this is really the crux and importance of law. Next slide. So I got a little bit wonky on this, but I love the details of this, and I get really excited about on how to kind of make the law real, right? It's seen as a really wonky area, but it's actually far easier to kind of understand. And so we created a platform called the Renewal Platform that starts to put this information out there. It starts to try to make this information more accessible. And one of the ways that we did this was by asking ourselves questions, right? When we're looking at the law, what are we really looking at? What do we need the law to do to protect our surface waters, to make that connection between sanitation and water resources management and even ocean governance? And so some of these questions here, like, is contamination prohibited? Just a basic starting point. Is there a way to even know if contamination has occurred, right? Have we even set out water quality standards? Have we identified effluent limitations? Do we require wastewater treatment plants to get permits? Do we require the people who install septic tanks to be licensed? Basic things like that helps to start to kind of help you understand if you even have that legal foundation in place to work with in order to protect surface waters and oceans. Is there a way to determine when and where there's been a contamination? So is monitoring and reporting requirement once you get this permit, do you actually have to tell people what you're doing? And then lastly, is there a way to reduce or prevent contamination? So here I talk a little bit about the human right to sanitation, the fact that having access to it and having a right, which is something justiciable, right? That I can go to the government and say, I have a right to sanitation. You need to help me get there, is important to ensuring all of these goals, right? Because if households don't have access to these services, then our surface waters and our groundwaters and our oceans are at risk. So I think with that, I'll end there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Alexandra. And everyone for the great overviews to help us paint this picture of what is WASH and what types of projects are taking place and what different organizations are involved. And that's just like a glimpse. What I'm learning is that it's a very big sector. And so now I have some specific follow-up questions that I'm going to ask each of you. We're going to do this for about 20 minutes, and then I'm going to open it up to the webinar participants for questions as well. So can I have all the panelists join me on camera? And thank you. All right, so like I said, I'll start off with one person, but with the question, but then I'd love everybody to chime in if they have things they'd like to add. So first question, Virginia, I'm going to start with you. Who needs WASH? Are there particular populations or locations, especially where our coral reef managers might be located, that they should be thinking about?
Yeah, great question. I think the first part of that, who needs WASH, is the easiest part to answer because that's everybody. Everybody needs WASH or access to WASH. But as we've seen, there are large parts of the world, large populations who don't have access to these basic services. And we see at WaterAid that the lack of access is often connected to wider poverty and development issues. It's related to poor governance, it's related to lack of financing, and it's often related to this slightly woolly concept of political will that you'll hear lots of advocacy people talking about a lot. We work with, at WaterAid, we work with mainly vulnerable and marginalised communities to try to change this. And we are seeing some progress. So there are some locations where we've been making really, really large step changes. So for example, if you look at India, over the term of the Narendra Modi government, there's been a kind of a step change in access to particularly sanitation, and now there's work going on water. But there are also countries where progress has either been very slow or is at risk of going backwards. So I'm thinking of places like Burkina Faso, Niger, Ethiopia, where coverage rates are low, especially in rural areas, so rural communities in particular. So to give you an example, to start putting some numbers on that, in Ethiopia, only 9% of the population have access to at least basic sanitation services at home. So again, this basic sanitation services at home, that means access to an improved sanitation facility like a toilet or a latrine that's not shared with another household. And in terms of other kind of population characteristics, the burden of the lack of WASH access falls disproportionately on women and girls and marginalised groups who might be denied access for a kind of a variety of social reasons. So we're talking about things like caste, disability and gender. And if your community of reef managers wants to kind of dig down into any of this detail to understand where and who is affected, I'd really recommend looking at the Joint Monitoring Programme, so we call that the JMP, which is hosted by the World Health Organization and UNICEF, and there you can find all of the kind of most up-to-date national level statistics on this kind of thing.
Thanks. Ian or Alexandra, anything to add to that about who needs WASH from your perspective, or particular populations and locations?
Sure, I can add to that just to take a slightly different angle, a more water security angle on it. Of course, everyone needs water, drinking water. I mean, I think most people know you can go longer without food than without water. It's essential to all life, plants, animals, and so forth. So really up and down a given watershed, everything that's living needs wash. You know, there's lots of different purposes for wash. We don't often think, maybe down at the reef level, we're not thinking about the impacts that agriculture is having on the water supply in the city that's right next to the reef, or the towns, or what have you. We're also not thinking about the industries that are using water for their productive purposes. Even so much you get into the reefs, you're talking about fisheries and, you know, fish manufacturing and processing, or I don't know about fish manufacturing, but fish processing at least. But the manufacturing facilities that are in a town or a city also require a lot of water, and they end up impacting the quality of it. So, you know, you have to look, when you're talking about how it impacts really down at the bottom. You know, there's this in water security, you look at reef to ridge type programming where you're talking about the whole system. So that when you're working at the reef level, you really have to understand that there's a lot of stakeholders upstream that are impacting the water that eventually reaches the reef and may you know, be problematic. At the very top, you know, there's foresters who are cutting down timber for their economic activity. There are herders who are moving their cattle through, who are starting to impact the land quality. And then, you know, in between, down, as you move down the watershed, you have communities and individuals and farmers and agriculture all also impacting the water around it. So you really have to see water through the whole ecosystem of the life system. And if you look at a watershed scale from the top of the watershed on down to the reef, there's a lot of players, and it's just really important to understand that as we get into some of the other questions today, that a lot of those players are really impacting reef health and need to be incorporated into the solutions and conversations.
Just to add to that, I think, you know, working on water security as well, that mindset, that perspective is critical to actually ensuring that everybody gets access to water. The issue is that there are some areas in which that's just not going to ultimately be possible, right? So there's going to be a mismatch between the population demand and the amount of water that's available for them, and the amount of resources available to bring, and well, the financial feasibility and the technological feasibility to bring water to them from other locations. And so that's why, in large part, one thing that immediately comes to mind is talking about this is that despite the fact that there are all these draws on water, we need to prioritize access to drinking water for people. And one of the issues is that the law doesn't often set that out. So there's this constant battle that everybody deserves access to water, but it's become, the statement is too broad. It's really that we all deserve access to drinking water, and then from there we can prioritize, like the environment, for example. We can prioritize agriculture, we can prioritize industries that we need in order to survive. Energy, for example, renewable energy. I mean, that's come up in the recent drought, right? Certain hydropower hasn't been able to function in the US because of the drought, despite the fact that we need that as an energy source. So it's that there's always going to be those draws that are necessary for human life, except, as Ian said, we all need drinking water to survive. So if we don't prioritize that, we're not going to be alive to enjoy the industries that we're also providing water for. And so that prioritization, especially in law, but actually practiced and understood, is really critical, even if we take that water security perspective.
Thanks. Thank you, guys. I'll just add, I think a lot of our audience does work ridge to reef. That's a thing that's in practice right now with a lot of reef managers. And have engaged often upper watershed communities or agricultural communities, but usually with the lens of like reducing sediment impacts or things like that. And I guess what might be interesting to think about in the discussion is, is the lens that the wash sector is coming in. It's what I'm hearing is perhaps it's around water for people, and the managers that are trying to protect the reefs, they might be thinking, okay, well, we need that fresh water hitting the reef so the corals can grow and the fish can grow. But yeah, so how does that dialogue, I'm just planting that seed because there's definitely an awareness of the upper watershed work happening within the reef management community. But yeah, maybe it's coming at it at a different angle, and how do we integrate this a bit? I'd like to explore that later. So let me move to the next question. So this one, Ian, I'm going to start with you. How does WASH intersect with the issue of wastewater pollution? We were kind of getting there a little bit in your initial comments. And what are the common goals? That's a little bit of what I was just sort of talking about too.
Yeah, so I mean, just to comment on your comment first, but it'll all flow into another. It's not just reef, kind of the reef, the ends, kind of the coral and stuff that needs to take this kind of systems understanding. Even drinking water supply at the bottom of the watershed needs to work with agriculture producers, herders, industry, and so forth to address its water supply. To give the example, the most probably globally recognized example is what happened with the Cape Town water supply several years ago, where the whole world was abuzz because Cape Town's day zero was coming. And ultimately, I think if you kind of post-analysis of what happened there was tons of agricultural consumption of water upstream that was affecting the quality and quantity of available water. But also there was, I want to say, like 30% of the water, I may get this number wrong, but 30% of the water was being consumed by invasive species, thirsty plants upstream that were non-native to South Africa. So part of the solution was actually removing a large quantity of those invasive species that were drinking all the waters to allow more water to flow into the water table. That's just an example of the drinking water supply being affected by upstream concerns. There are many others, of course, but to get back to the question more directly, how does WASH intersect with the issue of wastewater pollution? You got a good picture on one of the previous slides of the wastewater, the kind of pipe just flowing right into the water, which is disgusting and true. It happens everywhere. I'm sure I know there are many statistics. I don't have them off the top of my head, but obviously the contamination of drinking water, as Alexandra noted, is of primary importance to the WASH sector. And as soon as you have whatever contaminant it is from an industry, from a latrine, from someone throwing their plastic wrapper, from animals trampling nearby and going urinating or defecating on the water supply, that impacts the WASH sector. So keeping the water clean is really important. You get into water security discussions. You also talk about water scarcity. So what happens when there's not enough water? And I think Virginia comments addressed or talked to that. And it's not just in these kind of remote, arid regions that we think of on TV, but also in the very cities where they don't have access to water, they don't have services that are right next to the reef or very at the bottom of the watershed. So contamination of drinking water is really important, and wastewater is a big component to that. And that goes directly with transmission of disease. And if we look at how humans operate and the loss of productivity that we have during our weeks and days and months, and the lack of being missing from school, all that has to do with transmission of disease. So having good WASH, clean water, appropriate sanitation, appropriately managed wastewater is really important for reducing disease reduction or reducing diseases. And lastly, the third thing I have here is the effects on the environment. It's not just beauty that we're looking at in the environment, and it's not just our health, but it's also when we get into like GDP and talk about the dollars and cents of WASH, we turn an interesting eye to that. So you're looking at agriculture production, you're looking at industrial output, you're looking at tourism dollars. So people don't want to go see polluted rivers and lakes and streams and oceans. They just don't. They go to see rivers, they pay lots of dollars to go see fish. I'm not telling anything new to your audience here. Obviously the fisheries is really important in the food supply, the food security situation. So it's all kind of linked up. So that's one common goal, is contributing to the GDP. The second goal, I would say, that mitigating the impact on the environment, so cleaning the rivers, waterways, reducing the groundwater contamination, and improving the ocean health. As I mentioned, improving health and productivity, and then providing the sustainable access that everyone needs, equitable access for both the poor and the wealthy. Often the wealthy can bypass these inconveniences of pollution because they have the resources to do it, but the poor that are otherwise unable to access clean resources. Certainly, this is an intersection for the reducing pollution and mitigating the impact on the water supply. Thanks.
Thanks. Alexandra or Virginia, would like to add anything to common goals or intersections with wastewater pollution?
I mean, well, I would say one thing in particular. I mean, it's part of the challenge is like, so for example, Virginia mentioned earlier that India had made significant advancements through their Sewage under Modi. And it's true. I mean, they invested I believe over $1 billion in getting like just an exponential amount of access to sanitation. One of the challenges that we found in talking to different stakeholders on the ground was that there was some misunderstanding about the dual pit latrine situation. So the money, technically, when you got the money, you were supposed to have these services, these pit latrines built by somebody who was licensed, which didn't often happen. And even if you did, there was a misunderstanding about the technology. So the way that these are built, there's holes in them, and people thought that the holes meant that it was a failing system. There's a lot of technical stuff there, but the idea is that it wasn't required that when you received it, you had to put this in. It was suggested, but it wasn't required, and there was no monitoring and reporting. It wasn't like when the pit latrine was built that there was some later oversight that went over, inspected it, and approved it. And so what's happened is that single pit latrines were installed, and there's no dual pit latrine to ensure that the family can go back and forth between the two without needing to vacuum it out. And so now there's going to be a challenge in, I would say, probably ongoing today, given that when we were talking to these stakeholders, it was at the end of 2019, but starting today, moving into the future of how do you get a vacuum vehicle in there to take the waste out, and then where are you going to treat it? So this is also part of the thinking, is that when we invest money, it's really critical to have those rules in place, and it's critical to have that oversight, because it is very technologically difficult, and people need to understand like the science behind it and be overseen, right? There needs to be a checkpoint on this. And that's, I think, critical to the sector as well, as understanding that when you have those clear rules, you're going to see greater success, at least more lasting success. And this was actually something we talked about as well, that while the success story is quick there, and it was a success story, in 5 years, are they going to see the same success numbers? And so I think that's also just another part of this whole connection to wastewater.
Thanks. Can I move on to the third question? Because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A as well. So actually, Alexandra, I'm going to start with you on this one. What projects in this sector could benefit from a reef manager's perspective? And how can managers and practitioners engage with the WASH sector?
That's a great question. Far less doomsday than I just answered. So that's probably a positive. Frankly, the perspective is really critical, right? I mean, I think WASH, again, as I mentioned earlier, that there's these silos between these different areas of the water sector. And so what happens is we don't necessarily have that context, right? People working in WASH don't necessarily know that there are benefits felt by the coral reefs, right? They're not even thinking to the ocean. And in many instances, they aren't, because they may be working in a landlocked country. And so they're not even thinking about transboundary waters and like very, very downstream impacts and things like that. So bringing all these stakeholders together who work together in the water sector is a great way to start to kind of bridge those divides. But it starts with knowledge. It starts with even knowing that there is an impact on the coral reefs, with seeing the impact. I think that's, even in the WASH sector, when you can see the difference between what a community looks like before and after sanitation has been installed, or the water itself, you can run the test, you can even see it, right? Often you can't see all the changes to the water, but in many instances you can, especially when you're dealing with no wastewater to some form of wastewater treatment. But having those connections, understanding that there is that impact, seeing the impact, and actually bridging that divide. I mean, the other part I would say as well is that sometimes governments don't prioritize WASH. I would still say water in general is not a priority of governments. Other things, even food security, national security, other things continue to take priority. Even climate change is taking priority without really consideration of the water impact. And so I say that because oftentimes when I'm speaking to stakeholders and they're like, look, the government is focused on water resources management. They don't care about WASH. I'm like, perfect. You still have an opportunity to talk about WASH. And here's why. And you have to make that case. So if you're trying to bring attention to the impact that certain, like nitrates, for example, are having on coral reefs or on ocean quality in general, you can go speak to these stakeholders and they can become these WASH stakeholders and they can become your advocates in this sector, right? They're meeting with WASH advocates, they're meeting with water resources people. They, as a group, you can bring attention to that connection and maybe bring about that change together.
Thanks. Virginia, Ian, more to add on this one?
Yeah, I have a little bit to add. I just want to build a little bit on what Alexandra was saying, to say, you know, while water and WASH are kind of not, don't receive a great deal of attention, I think sanitation in particular gets forgotten. And so there's even more of a kind of motivation really to build on that. In terms of how can the WASH sector and reef managers work together, I mean, I think it's really around this question of advocacy. We find that when we have broader coalitions or broader groups of people asking or calling for the same thing, it has more impact. And so I would say that joining forces with another sector is potentially quite exciting. And there are certainly lots of entry points that we heard about in the previous discussion. But one that I think is really important is really around ensuring that sanitation is safely managed, because that's where the source of some of this pollution is coming from, whether we're talking about sewage or non-sewage forms of sanitation. And I just wanted to very quickly flag a specific piece of work that WaterAid has been doing. And I think my colleague Andres Huso, who wrote this piece, might be listening to this. But we've been doing some work on the functionality of wastewater treatment plants and seeing that really a very significant number of those are not working. And this is a problem not only because of the immediate environmental impacts and public health impacts of that, but because, you know, these wastewater treatment plants is where the money is going. A lot of money is going to that. And there are things that we can do in terms of asking donors to change the way they look at sustainability in their portfolios around operation and maintenance. So there's stuff to say and things to advocate on. So yes, please, reaching out across sectors and arguing for things together. It's exciting.
I think that would be of interest for sure, because I think for at least my experience as a former manager, usually the main solution you hear about initially is wastewater treatment as your option to address this. And then if you're saying that that's not actually working necessarily, then yeah, I think there's so we'll have to connect on how we can learn more about that as the managers try to figure out which strategy do they try to put energy behind, you know. Ian, do you have anything to add on this one before I open it up for questions?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I agree with Virginia Alexandra's comments. I mean, for me, when you're talking different groups, you know, as I think Alexandra said, in the people that are working in WASH or digging wells upstream or you know, building toilets are not thinking about the reef, right? So you need to make it relevant to them, just as working with the reef, you need to make the WASH work relevant to them. So, you know, finding common ground like food security, when it affects the fish population that people are eating, that's an easy one. Tourism is also one that, especially the sanitation sector, is focused a little bit more on. It's easy to connect the tourism and the dollars with the governance part that you really need to connect these different pieces. So when you can kind of find those common elements that are affecting everyone, it can really help move people around. And then finally, you know, a common solution for this kind of ridge to reef kind of issue, cross-sectoral issue, is the payment for ecosystem services. And I don't want to simplify how difficult that is, but certainly when you connect the need for people to change behaviors upstream that affect the downstream, you can bring them to the table to identify and structure those solutions. It's more fruitful. It can be. Thanks.
Thank you, guys. So now I'm gonna transition into opening up for questions. So for the audience, there's two ways you can ask questions. I think we have a slide to show folks. I'm going to ask for Michelle, who's helping me behind the scenes. Is there a slide on this one? So I think there's two ways you can ask questions, and you can use that question box anytime right now. Start using it and send questions, and I'll ask them to the panelists. You can also raise your hand, and I will try to call on you. Click the small hand icon in the toolbar next to your name. I love that, actually, to call on people so we can hear your voices and know there's real people out there. So go ahead, send your questions in, and I can ask them while we have our panelists here. And I see Andres has shared the report, so maybe we can, Michelle, chat that into for everybody. I don't know, is everybody seeing that report? We'll make sure you guys get that link. Just a minute, I'm just scanning for questions. So, you know, to start us off on this, I have one other question based on kind of the things you guys have been talking about connecting with the wash sector. And I know, like, for us, this is sort of an introduction to what that is. And it's still, I have to say, for me, feels a bit huge. Like, so I want to connect with the wash sector in my place, right? What does that look like? Like, how do I do that if I can only speak for, so I was a manager in Hawaii for a long time. So I would, you know, who would I talk to first if I wanted to maybe start connecting with this sector a bit more, and look for these commonalities and start figuring out those common goals? Any suggestions where our managers should start? Because you guys all have these different organizations. There's private consulting, there's the law issues, there's these global organizations that we mentioned, but I gotta say, it still feels a little bit overwhelming. Thoughts?
I can take a first stab at it. Oh, Alexandra, do you want to go?
No, go ahead, please.
Sure.
Turn it off.
You're right to feel overwhelmed, Petra. Even ourselves, when we go into a new environment, there's so many actors and players, and part of it's because water is so transversal. I mean, it really touches everything, from climate to agriculture to gender to youth to, I mean, it really touches everything, and it's handled among different ministries. Like, if you look in a typical government, it could be the Ministry of Environment has a hand in it, the Ministry of Public Works, the Ministry of Rural Development, the Ministry of this and that. So it's very location dependent. If I was to walk into a reef community in Indonesia, say, you know, I would probably try to go to the mayor's office to orient myself a little bit around what government agencies are there. I would also try to identify what local NGOs are working, what international NGOs, and they are typically more cognizant of the different actors that are locally, you know, playing locally. But it's overwhelming for sure to say, oh, the wash sector. I mean, you're talking so many. You're talking private sector. You're talking nonprofit. You're talking government. You're talking for-profit. You're talking communities. You're talking individuals, you're talking a lot of folks.
Well, that's a good start, though. I think a lot of our managers either are placed in government themselves, and so there's probably a partner agency that they just might not have reached out to yet. That would be a good start. Other thoughts on where the managers should start at? Any other thoughts from other two panelists?
I mean, I think a great place is even your local wastewater treatment plant. It depends on where you are. I mean, when we have an internship class every summer, and we take our interns pre-COVID to the DC water, in large part because they've never seen something like that. They've never smelled something like that. And it's important, right? It's important to really understand how that works, where the waste comes from, the challenges, so that people will talk about, you know, the fact that the solid waste makes it into there and the challenges that they face as a result of it, the cost, and then what happens when you finish treatment. They really walk through the process. And I think that if you're looking to even learn more just about that one interconnection, they're typically a great resource. I think as Ian said, there's just so many governmental offices that have their hand somehow in this mix. I mean, land use, zoning, the financial department because they're the budget office, gender if they have one, water resources management. I mean, I think water resources management and public health, if you're thinking government, are always a good place to start, especially public health, because a lot of sanitation issues in particular are still housed somehow in the public health department. It depends, again, from country to country. And if you're more local, it also will depend on what the local governance structure is.
Thanks. Anything else on that one before I ask another one? I see a question coming in.
I think Alexandra and Ian covered it. It's a bit of stakeholder mapping is required.
Sounds like it. Okay. So this question here is, let me read it out. So from Chris, there's a wide range of sanitation options, and many in the sanitation field believe that decentralized approaches, or at least hybrid approaches, are more resilient than the big centralized treatment plants. When conservation groups advocate for better sanitation, are you specifically discussing the range of options? Anybody want to take a stab at that one?
I can have a go, and here is where I really wish that my colleague Andres, who leads on sanitation, was taking this one. But there are a range of sanitation options, and there are different kind of criteria and characteristics of each of them. And the sanitation context in different cities, depending on the kind of the population, urban planning, the kind of environmental context, all change. So there needs to be a kind of a discussion about how and which type of option that you choose. So that's not necessarily to say that, you know, sewered or non-sewered is better, or and these kind of things. So yes, these discussions need to happen. And I would also say that when you start thinking about things in terms of resilience, particularly climate resilience, now we have to be asking the resilience of what, for what, and for whom. And those are the kinds of questions that you need to be asking to unpack which is the best sanitation option. And Andres, if I've missed anything, do put it in the chat for everybody.
Yeah, and I can, and Andres, we can unmute you as well if you'd like to add anything in. Any other thoughts? Oh, wait, here we go. I've got another question I want to make sure to ask. Could the panel suggest the most efficient system design approach depending on the population of the cities in coastal areas? So I think it's kind of around, how do you even start figuring that out? Or do you have any suggestions or guidance on where they go to start figuring out a question like that?
Again, oh, sorry, Ian, you go.
Go ahead, Virginia.
Again, I think that this is one of these questions that you'd have to have in discussion with local planners and engineers, because it's not just based on the population. It will be based on all sorts of things, including what system is there before and how you build on that. So unfortunately, I'm not sure that there's an easy answer for that one.
Right, and it also, I mean, most likely involves upstream users as well and solutions for them. So it's more complicated than what system, which option should we choose, and let's build that. There's limited resources. The solution requirements are enormous. So it's oftentimes prioritizing where the best and most efficient use of resources is. But I agree with Virginia. You know, starting with city, you know, local planners. Local communities, oftentimes communities can solve their own problems in a very localized context, but as you know, if you're talking about the actual reef itself, then you've got all these contributors to it. So it's very multi-stakeholder for sure.
Yeah, and just two additional things to add. I mean, one is your law might actually set out certain requirements that may be considered. So that's that's national law or local law. It really depends. Especially non-sewer sanitation is typically more governed at the local level. And then the second thing that I always talk about is the equity factor, right? If your community cannot pay for a new wastewater treatment plant, or frankly, to pay to continue to maintain it or rebuild it in light of the climate change challenges that they're facing, then that needs to be part of the consideration. You can't just build infrastructure that costs millions and millions of dollars and see that as a sustainable solution if your community can't actually support that, if the customer base is changing. And so that the equity aspect is really critical. And I think Ian hit it right on the head when he said the community actually really should be engaged in this process. They know their community, they understand it. They may not have the technical capacity to build it themselves, though they might, but they are a central part of the conversation, especially when it comes to ability to pay and capacity.
Thanks. I think, Andres, I'm going to unmute you because he might have something to add here. See your hands raised. Andres, did you have something to add to the earlier comment or add on? Hi.
Yes, can you hear me? Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
No, thanks for the presentations and for the opportunity to chip in. I basically just to reinforce what Virginia has said, and particularly on the centralized versus decentralized. While it's true that in theory you can have more resilience if you have a network of decentralized treatment plant, my take really is that the key is to manage things properly. So in a particular context, it will be easier to manage decentralized properly, or it might be easier to manage a centralized treatment plant properly. So you need to look also at the institutional setup, at the do you have a vibrant private sector? Is it well regulated or not? Does it depend on the government? So I think I would reinforce that important that there is no one size fits all or a simple correlation between population or geography and treatment models. So there's that need to understand the context, and we have in the sector a very wide range of diagnostic tools that allow you to analyze what are the different flows of the waste are in a given city, what's the institutional setup, and so on. And that can also be an interesting resource. So this is a very famous one that is called the sheet flow diagrams, and you can Google it, and there's you have a world map with these diagrams for different cities where you can see the different mixes of technologies and how they are addressing those issues. So that could be also a source of inspirations. For instance, you could look at the coastal cities and see what mix of technologies they have and what gaps they normally have. Yeah, thank you.
I've heard of those diagrams. I think we have some links on our toolkit or the new practitioner's guide that the Sewage Alliance is putting out. They have some, as our whole membership and audience is trying to understand this issue, those kind of things are very helpful. So one question, thanks Andres for adding all that. One final question, I think we have a little bit of time before I have to wrap up. I'm just curious, the law, how much is that? I mean, I hear it's an important you have to have the maintenance structure in place, and you have to make sure people are doing that or required to do it. So, I mean, do you start this whole thing with trying to integrate or learn about the wash sector and meet those people, or do you focus your energy on trying to understand your legal structure and start there because that's the house for everything? Just curious, thoughts.
Well, I'm clearly biased, but I would absolutely start with the legal side. But I think you actually answered the question yourself, because you said it was the house, right? It's actually the house of everything. It lays out, it's the foundation, it's everything. It lays out what has to be done. And I think it's helpful if your community doesn't have certain rules around contamination, the release of effluent or effluent limitations or water quality standards or institutions, right? Even opportunities for public consultation. If those things don't exist, those are perfect entry points for starting to ask for change or knowing that there's an issue. And so for me, it kind of lays out, it's like a map essentially of where you need to start to, I guess it's more of an action map. If you're concerned that the laws, that you aren't getting the results that you need, right? The coral reefs are still struggling, the oceans are still struggling, then the surface waters are still contaminated, then that's where you start. And it may not be the law as written, it also may be the performance. So you might look at it and say, well, there aren't any enforcement mechanisms, right? Or the enforcement is spread across 3 different ministries and there's no communication mechanism. Actually, mandates and institutions are a critical part of this, and governmental mandates are often either not clear or they're spread out across a lot of different institutions. So, but that's where you can also work with people. I mean, we have a number of resources too. Like I said, I mentioned earlier, the Renewal Platform that's starting to make that. If there are questions, we actually have a program called the Blue Phone, where we offer technical assistance funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to answer legal questions, because we know it's really difficult to do, and we're more interested in giving you the tools to advocate for what you need than having you try to figure it out and struggle to get that information.
Great. Thanks, Alexandra. Virginia, did you have something you wanted to add?
No, I'm writing notes.
Yeah, we'll get some of these links and resources to send out. So we are actually out of time. I'm sorry, I have to wrap up the discussion. We will have a chance for you to post questions on the network forum if you have some that didn't get answered. So you can join that forum on our website and continue this conversation. Please share any feedback you have on this topic for our, remember, we're doing this series. We still have some more to plan. And so if there's other topics, we have a survey at the end of the webinar right now that will help us prioritize future topics. We are going to be sending out this recording, and I really want to thank our panelists for taking time out of their busy schedules to meet with our audience as we try to learn about this sector and all get this work done together. So thank you so much. Appreciate everybody's time, and I hope everybody has a great day or evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Petra.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.